You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Founded in 1881, the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War is a congressionally chartered, charitable, fraternal organization that preserves the history and legacy of the Union veterans who fought during the Civil War to save the Union and end slavery.
When you join, you enter a national network of men who form lifelong bonds, honor their heroic ancestors, and promote historic preservation, education, and patriotism in their communities.
The Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War accepts both descendants of Civil War veterans and non-descendants. Visit them today at www.suvcw.org or email them at join@suvcw.org.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the SUVCW.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode number 461 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Welcome to the podcast.
The genesis of this episode was a moment when we were putting together the podcast timeline for the first part of 1864, and in one of the sources we were consulting, there was an entry which said that in February 1864, the Confederate Congress allocated $1 million for Canadian-based espionage and sabotage operations. And that's really all it said. But, well, that was enough to pique our curiosity.
We already knew about some connections to Canada with the unsuccessful Confederate plan to free the captives at the POW camp on Johnson's Island on the coast of Lake Erie. And then, of course, there was the raid on the town of St. Albans, Vermont, but that pretty much exhausted our knowledge on the subject.
However, a bit of digging turned up some really interesting information on Confederate clandestine activities in Canada during the Civil War. And when it looked like there'd be enough to put together a show on that topic, we decided to put it on the list of future episodes. And, well, this is that show.
In February 1864, the Confederate Congress passed a bill establishing a Secret Service fund of $5 million, of which $1 million was set aside for operations based in Canada. By the way, even though our modern mind goes in a different direction, back then, Secret Service was the term used for espionage and sabotage activities.
Exactly. And in 1864, when the Confederacy began sending commissioners to Canada to direct the activities of a large-scale covert network, the government official in Richmond in charge of Confederate Secret Service operations was Secretary of State Judah Benjamin. In February 1864, Benjamin was 52 years old and was one of Confederate President Jefferson Davis's most trusted advisors. During the Civil War, he would serve as the Confederacy's Attorney General, Secretary of War, and Secretary of State.
Not all at the same time, of course.
Right, although scholars have called him the brains of the Confederacy. Well, in any case, before the war, he was a successful, wealthy lawyer in New Orleans and served in both the Louisiana State House and Senate before being sent to Washington in 1853 as a U.S. Senator.
All of that's to say that Benjamin was not only a savvy political operator who was Jefferson Davis's right-hand man, but he was also one smart cookie and a good choice to direct the operations of the Confederate Secret Service. In February 1864, when the Confederate Congress provided $5 million for Secret Service operations, Judah Benjamin had complete discretion as to how the money would be used.
And, as we said, a sizable chunk of that Secret Service money, $1 million, was earmarked for Canadian-based espionage and sabotage operations. When those at the highest levels of the Confederate government, including Judah Benjamin, Jefferson Davis, and Secretary of War James Seddon, decided that an organized, determined effort should be made to open up another front in the war, steps were taken beginning in 1864 to set up a cloak and dagger network of operatives north of the border, which would not only engage in spying and intelligence gathering, but would facilitate attacks by rebel agents on targets across the U.S.-Canadian border.
In 1864, Canada was still part of the British Empire, and so was ostensibly neutral with regard to the American Civil War. However, while many Canadians were morally opposed to slavery, a large portion of the population sympathized with the cause of Confederate independence. This was mostly because they believed that, in the long run, having a permanently divided United States was in the best interest of Britain and British Canada.
Well, during and after the American Revolution, tens of thousands of Loyalists had fled to Canada. And Loyalists were those who supported the British Crown and opposed American independence. Well, naturally, their descendants were in favor of anything that would weaken the United States, such as a Confederate victory in the Civil War.
In addition, Canadian businesses and banks had strong financial ties to the Confederacy through the blockade and the lucrative cotton for contraband trade. Halifax in Nova Scotia was a primary destination for blockade runners, both departing and setting out for Confederate ports. At Halifax, cotton and tobacco were exchanged for contraband goods, such as medical supplies, arms and ammunition, foodstuffs, uniforms, and luxury items.
Most Canadian newspapers, the vast majority in fact, were unstinting in their praise of the Confederacy. This not only mirrored public opinion and the views of many government officials, but it also reflected the ability of Confederate Secret Service dollars to buy favorable editorials that appeared in the papers on a regular basis.
Interestingly, Canada also served as a refuge for Confederate soldiers, that is, escaped prisoners of war, who had found it easier to flee north to Canada rather than try to make their way south back to the Confederacy.
So, all in all, Canada was fertile ground for the Confederacy to set up covert operations, and a shadowy group of secret agents, adventurers, and other Confederate sympathizers would use our neighbor to the north as a safe haven to plan and organize activities aimed at undermining the Union war effort.
The groundwork for Confederate Secret Service activities in Canada was laid early in the war by exiles and escaping POWs.
Early in the war, to avoid harassment and outright incarceration, quite a few Confederate sympathizers in the turbulent border states, especially Maryland, fled. Most went south, but others went north to Canada and settled in Halifax, Toronto, and especially Montreal, which was then Canada's largest city and banking center.
By 1862, men such as Patrick Martin and George Kane of Baltimore, both strident Confederate sympathizers, were living in exile in Montreal. Along with others who had been leaders in their communities, whether public officials or prominent businessmen, they kept in touch with the Davis administration in Richmond, and they soon became semi-official emissaries for the Confederacy in Canada.
Right. Newly arrived exiles went to them looking for help, advice, or money. British officers looking to visit the Confederate armies as military observers went to them for letters of introduction, enabling them to reach Virginia by way of secret courier lines through southern Maryland.
Anyone wanting to do business with the Confederacy also called on them, and this early trickle of commercial interest in trading with the Confederates grew as the profits from blockade running became apparent.
Some of those semi-official Confederate agents in Canada, most notably Patrick Martin, also aided espionage and sabotage operations. Funding came from Richmond by way of couriers and was supplemented by profits from blockade running. Most of these activities were laughably amateurish and suffered from poor operational security, but nevertheless, by 1863, the Confederate Secret Service was well established in Canada.
As more and more escaped POWs made their way to Canada, the fledgling Confederate Secret Service found itself with newfound muscle at their disposal. This was especially true when a large number of John Hunt Morgan's men, fresh from their raid into Ohio in the summer of 1863, escaped captivity and crossed the border into Canada.
Those rebel cavalrymen evolved into a sort of armed wing of the Confederate Secret Service in Canada, capable of carrying out raids such as the one on St. Albans, Vermont. And we'll talk in more detail about the St. Albans raid in a future episode when it comes up on the podcast timeline in October 1864.
This episode of the podcast is sponsored by the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War.
Do you have an interest in the Civil War? Founded in 1881, the SUV-CW is a congressionally chartered, charitable, fraternal organization that preserves the history and legacy of the Union veterans who fought during the Civil War to save the Union and end slavery.
The national headquarters of the SUV-CW is located at the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. When you join, you enter a national network of men who form lifelong bonds, honor their heroic ancestors, and promote historic preservation, education, and patriotism in their communities.
The SUV-CW is the heir to the legacy of the Grand Army of the Republic, the famous post-war National Association of Union Civil War Veterans. Based on the principles of fraternity, charity, and loyalty, the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War accepts both descendants of Civil War veterans and non-descendants. Visit them today at www.suvcw.org or email them at join@suvcw.org.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the SUV-CW.
How did America go from a struggling series of settlements at the edge of a wilderness into the most powerful, prosperous, influential nation anywhere on Earth? A lot of people say, well, it's just a pattern of happy accidents. But a pattern of happy accidents is still a pattern. The American Miracle tells that story. This is Michael Medved. I've been a historian for many years, 14 books, a radio host, fascinated during all that time with the bizarre series of coincidences that allowed the United States to acquire Alaska, or the Louisiana Purchase. Individuals in our past who seem to have been providentially placed where they could make a major difference. Subscribe to The American Miracle on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts.
By early 1864, Judah Benjamin and Jefferson Davis had decided the Confederate Secret Service activities in Canada, which up until that time had been amateurish and slapdash, would benefit from better direction and a significant boost in funding.
As a result, Davis and Benjamin sent Jacob Thompson to Canada. He arrived in May 1864. The 54-year-old Thompson was a native North Carolinian, but had moved to Mississippi and opened a law practice there in 1837. He served in Washington as a congressman from Mississippi, lost a Senate bid to a fellow named Jefferson Davis, then served as Secretary of the Interior in James Buchanan's administration prior to the Civil War.
When Thompson arrived in Canada, he carried with him bills of exchange in gold and hard currencies worth $1 million. Those funds would be supplemented with profits from blockade running and by additional advances from Richmond.
This money was held on deposit in various banks, including in Montreal and a bank in the town of St. Catharines in Ontario. St. Catharines, on the rail line and just across the border from Buffalo, New York, would serve, along with Montreal, as one of the hubs of Confederate Secret Service activity in Canada.
The amount of funds deposited in the two banks in Montreal and St. Catharines gave the Confederates enormous influence, if not de facto control, of those institutions.
The president and manager of the Montreal Bank allowed Jacob Thompson to issue bank drafts in the names of bank employees, who then endorsed them to the real intended recipients of the money. This was an early example of money laundering, and it's how Benjamin Wood, the brother of the mayor of New York City, received a $25,000 payment. Wood was owner and editor of the New York Daily News, a Democratic congressman, and a vocal critic of the Lincoln administration.
After Lincoln assassin John Wilkes Booth's death, when his body was searched, they found in his possession a negotiable cashier's check from the bank in Montreal, signed by Henry Starnes, the bank president. Booth is known to have visited Montreal in the fall of 1864 and been in contact with Confederate agents there.
The presence of John Wilkes Booth in Montreal in the fall of 1864 is well established, but remains a murky part of Civil War history. It can't be said with certainty, but it's likely Booth was in Montreal to meet with members of the Confederate Secret Service to discuss a plan for kidnapping Abraham Lincoln. If true, the origins of the plot that culminated with the assassination of Lincoln can be traced directly to these meetings. Booth's own diary points to this possibility with the words, quote, "For 6 months we had worked to capture," end quote. Written in April 1865, this places the beginning of the plot back to the fall of 1864, precisely when Booth was in Montreal. Okay, well, obviously the Lincoln assassination is a story for future episodes, but we did just want to mention in this show that there is this connection between John Wilkes Booth and Montreal and the Confederate Secret Service in Canada.
Jefferson Davis and Judah Benjamin no doubt had high hopes when they sent Jacob Thompson to Canada. But if they were expecting that the Confederate Secret Service there would function as a highly effective, well-oiled machine under his direction, then they were destined to be disappointed.
Thompson was only one of a number of men the Davis administration sent to Canada in 1864, including Clement Clay, George Sanders, Beverly Tucker, J.C. Holcomb, and William Cleary. These men, who had no official status in Canada, were nevertheless known to be official representatives of the Confederate government and were known as the quote-unquote Confederate Cabinet.
While Thompson was the leader of the Confederate Secret Service in Canada, each of the men had considerable latitude to conduct their own operations. For example, Holcomb was responsible for arranging a system to return escaped POWs arriving in Canada to the Confederacy.
Clement Clay focused on cross-border raids and strikes against federal prison camps. George Sanders led unsuccessful peace initiatives in Niagara Falls, designed to embarrass the Lincoln administration in the run-up to the 1864 elections. And Tucker focused on putting together a massive cotton for contraband deal.
The Confederate leadership in Canada followed a series of fragmented agendas, and since most of those agendas, to one degree or another, intersected with Secret Service operations, that meant Secret Service activities suffered from lack of focus and increased chances for plans to be compromised.
There were too many chefs in the kitchen, but Thompson did his best to make the situation work, however awkward it might be. But nonetheless, Sanders and Clay proved particularly troublesome. George Sanders was opinionated and not inclined to take orders. Clement Clay had no interest in playing second fiddle to Thompson.
Rather than work with Thompson in Montreal, Clay set up shop in St. Catharines. Their military advisor, Captain Thomas Hines, later described the clash of personalities, saying, quote, "The commissioners were not harmonious from the inception of their mission. This proved one of the most potent obstacles for success. They found it impossible to agree."
Hines continued, and his account shows that Jacob Thompson was perhaps not the best person to head up a clandestine organization. Quote, "Thompson was a man of sterling integrity, but was inclined to believe too much that was told to him, to trust too many men, to doubt too little, and suspect less. His subordinates were kept in continual apprehension, lest he compromise their efforts by indiscreet confidences."
Hines' associate, Captain John Castleman, liked Thompson, but found Clay, quote, "not practical. He lacked judgment. He was peevish, irritable, and suspicious. He distrusted Mr. Thompson and relied on those who were often untrustworthy."
Despite Clay's aversion to working with Thompson, and in spite of the lack of coordination between members of the so-called Confederate Cabinet in Canada, they were still able to build an impressive clandestine apparatus. It consisted of spies, couriers, safe houses, friendly bankers, armed raiders, a host of Canadian supporters, and a small army of hangers-on willing to do just about anything for the Confederate cause.
From Halifax, Quebec City, Toronto, Hamilton, St. Catharines, and especially from Montreal, the Confederate Secret Service managed to mount numerous operations out of Canada, including 2 unsuccessful attempts in 1863 and 1864 to free the Confederate POWs at Johnson's Island.
In 1864, Confederate Secret Service agents Robert Martin, John Headley, Robert Kennedy, John Price, and others orchestrated attempts to burn hotels in New York City. And from Montreal, Confederate bankers John Porterfield and George Payne set up an operation in New York to undermine the U.S. paper currency, the greenback, by driving up the price of gold.
1864 would be a critical election year in the United States, and so from Canada, the Confederates not only made intensive efforts to aid anti-war Democrats, called Copperheads, in Midwestern states like Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana, but rebel agents also worked to directly influence the Democratic Convention in Chicago in late August 1864.
Throughout all of this, British and Canadian authorities looked the other way and made no effort to rein in Confederate Secret Service activities in Canada. This only changed with the St. Albans raid in October 1864, which finally embarrassed the Confederate government into taking action to make it illegal to plan or undertake acts of war from Canadian soil.
As part of the fallout from the St. Albans raid, the Davis administration sent Brigadier General Edwin Lee to Canada to take over Confederate Secret Service operations there.
Lee, a Virginian and a first cousin once removed of Robert E. Lee, was a veteran of numerous campaigns in the Eastern Theater of the war. He and his wife arrived in Montreal in December 1864. However, by that time, the crackdown by the authorities after the St. Albans raid, as well as increasing pressure from U.S. counterintelligence agents, was significantly impacting Confederate Secret Service operations in Canada.
By far, the most damage was done by double agents, the most famous, or infamous, of whom was Arkansas native Godfrey Hyams. Hyams passed along information about Confederate Secret Service plots directly to Robert Harrison, Toronto's Crown Attorney.
By the end of the war in the spring of 1865, the Confederate Secret Service operation in Canada was a shambles. Thompson sailed for England in April, and he spent 2 years in Europe before returning to Mississippi. Clay had returned to the Confederacy in November 1864, after the St. Albans raid. Edwin Lee and his wife remained in Montreal until the spring of 1866, when they returned to Virginia.
An interesting postscript to the story of Confederate activities in Canada during the Civil War is Jefferson Davis's time in Montreal.
As many of you know, after his capture in Georgia at the end of the war, Davis was held at Fortress Monroe in Virginia. When Davis's wife, Verena, was released from virtual house arrest at the Pulaski Hotel in Savannah, Georgia, in the summer of 1865, she wasn't permitted to visit her husband. Earlier, fearing for the safety of their 4 children, she had sent them with her mother to seek refuge in Montreal. After Verena's release, she followed her children north to Canada. When, after nearly 2 years of imprisonment, Jefferson Davis was ultimately freed in 1867 on $100,000 bail posted by Horace Greeley, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and others, he joined his family in Montreal. During his time there, Davis refused most invitations to social events and rarely appeared in public, although he did make a trip to Niagara-on-the-Lake in Ontario to visit Jubal Early and other ex-Confederates living in Canada. Well, eventually the Davis family left Canada and traveled to Europe, where they stayed for a time before returning to the United States for good in 1869.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Montreal, City of Secrets, Confederate Operations in Montreal During the American Civil War by Barry Sheehy.
You can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org. Also at the podcast website is information about how to join the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and support the podcast in that way, just like Jeff H., Steve R., Henry T., Clint R., Christian H., and Kasood F.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.